like about Douglas is it's on the Isle of Man.
Good nights out to be had.
Lots of pubs.
If Douglas was an animal,
It would be one of those lizards you see on the TV that can be quite animated and energetic, but sleep quite a lot of the time.
Mark Steele's in town.
Thanks very much. Welcome to Mark Steele's in Town, which this week comes from the Gaiety Theatre, an extraordinary building in Douglas, capital of the Isle of Man. And it is wonderful to be in a place with such a positive attitude, even during a global recession, with the sense to invest in one of the few industries still booming, fiddling tax. And that was the end of this week's Mark Steele's in Town. I might be being unfair, of course. It may well be that the companies who come here aren't just thinking about the low rates of tax. They're thinking, we'll base our computer company in the Isle of Man because it will be handy if we need a four-horned ram for any reason. Oh, really? I hadn't really looked at the tax rates. Now, something that you do grasp here very quickly, I think, as a visitor, is how helpful everybody is, especially with making sure that everybody who comes here knows the ferry times. It's a very kind part of your nature, because you've only got to say, could you put the heating on? It's a bit chilly here. And you're told, if you don't like it, there's a bolt in the morning. And then you realise this is, in fact, the slogan for the island. If someone complains about anything, in fact, your tourist brochure must be the shortest tourist brochure in the world. It just goes, come and visit the Isle of Man. If you don't like it, there's a bolt in the morning. So we're in the middle of the Irish Sea, because not everybody knows this. We're in the middle of the Irish Sea. We're less than 40 miles from England, Scotland, Ireland or Wales. And it is a bit strange here as a visitor. For example, you get off the ferry and the first thing you see in Douglas is these huge letters on a hill, like the ones in Hollywood, except they say electric railway. Like the place thinks no one will believe that our railway is actually electric. I'm sorry to disappoint you, Douglas, but electric railways aren't that much of a tourist attraction, really. Not since the 1950s. I bet page 2 of the tourist brochure goes, come to Douglas and marvel at our inside toilets. And our amazing cinema with moving pictures. But that wasn't the strangest part of my first morning here. I went for a walk, and at the top of a cliff there's this wonderful, beautiful bay called Happy Valley. And there was a man in a sort of council-looking uniform with a walkie-talkie. So I asked what he was doing, and he said, see my colleagues down there on the beach? Well, they're burying a dead cow that fell off a cliff. Now, this might be because of a bit of a cultural divide, but I should tell you, that doesn't happen all that often in London. Now, you do have your own general elections. In fact, you had one not long ago, didn't you? Nothing to do at all with UK politicians, which I think is brilliant, because it means you don't have any scandals about politicians fiddling expenses. There's no scandals about politicians fiddling expenses, because the whole island's on the fiddle, so that's much more democratic. The system seems to be that you vote mostly for sort of random people who aren't necessarily in any party, and they choose a chief minister who at the moment is Alan Bell. And this system seems to create a much healthier respect for your leaders than we have in the UK. For example, I had a look on the Isle of Man forum, the bit that deals with politics, and someone wrote the following. Manx Radio played a suitably depressive dirge following the election of Bell. I wonder what it was. And someone replied, that was Alan Bell's acceptance speech. The attitude of some people here does remind me of Britain. There was this thoughtful insight as well from the Isle of Man forum. I will never shut up while my fellow islanders are continually shafted by this jumped-up chicken dung government headed by the Council of Ministers aided by Freemasonry. And I read this, I thought, well, he's a bit cross. Must have uncovered evidence of something that could destroy the Manx establishment. What could this corruption be? And he went on to explain. I was booked on this morning's 7 a.m. sailing to Liverpool. And the brand new Costa Coffee was shut. Despite a notice on the door that said open at 6:30 a.m. Now, I have to tell you, I'm not generally a fan of politicians, but can you really call them chicken dung on the grounds that Costa Coffee wasn't open at 6:30? You're clearly more demanding than I am. You're the Minister of Education. Pour me a coffee. Now, also, you've had quite a few celebrities from the UK come to live here in the Isle of Man lately, and it's always gone well, as far as I can see. Andy Kershaw, that was a big success. Just blended in absolutely perfectly, just politely playing global music in between arrests, and you hardly noticed him. And then Jeremy Clarkson popped over. And that's gone wonderfully well, with no controversy at all. Jeremy bought a lighthouse with a cottage, but complained that some people were walking around the edge and taking photos. So he closed the walkway off with a fence, and now the courts have said that he's got to open it up again. What probably annoyed him was not so much that people were taking photos, more that they were walking, I should think. If they'd driven over his lawn in an Alfa Romeo, he'd have gone, and that's better! Don't come past my lighthouse with your hippie walking! Also, if you don't want people on an island to notice you, is it the best move to buy a lighthouse? This is what I think is brilliant here, and you notice it as soon as you arrive. There is such a strong sense of Manx identity. Your symbol of the three joined legs, it's everywhere. It's on every dust cart, it's on street signs, most buildings, bandstands in Noble Park. It's on every lamp post in some bits. Why does it have to be on every lamp post? Are you worried if it was only on every third lamp post, you might be walking along and think, oh, I've forgotten where I am. Am I in Germany? Let's look at the lamp post for a clue. Nothing! The TT motorbike race must be the most exciting thing that happens here all year, I would think. I mean, I don't mean that in a derogatory way. I should explain this, because everybody will know this. There isn't a separate racetrack, like Brands Hatch or something. The normal roads are the race course. I must say, if you live here, isn't that a bit inconvenient? Must be like if once a year you said, right, now we can't use the kitchen for the next week, because this is the week when it gets turned into an arena for international bear fighting. Another sign here of national pride is that loads of people have told me ours is the oldest continuous parliament in the world. And the first time that I heard this, I made the mistake of saying, oh, really? I thought that was in Iceland. And I might as well have said, I spit on your three legs, sir! It was the equivalent of riding into Mecca on the back of a pig. They went, Iceland hasn't been continuous, though, has it? Apparently, the Parliament here was set up in the 10th century by the Norse, who called it the Thing. I'd have to say, they were decent warriors, the Norse, but with creative writing, they let themselves down, didn't they? So it was almost independent, the Isle of Man, even then. But eventually, in the 1700s, you know what you got up to? Smuggling. Anything that was supposed to go to England that had customs duty on it was diverted over here and smuggled. As if it's in the blood. What I think sums up the history here is the law that the British brought in to try and stop the smuggling, because they called it the Mischief Act. That's so English, isn't it? They must have gone, do you know what they're getting up to in the Isle of Man? I probably shouldn't say this in polite company. It's mischief, that's what it is. The 19th century, it changed a bit. You had to find a different line of business to keep going, and so the island became one of the world's first, I think, mass tourist resorts, which is why this book on the history of tourism to the Isle of Man was able to include this sentence, I quote, "The First World War brought disaster because the Isle of Man was starved of visitors." I've always said that the most disastrous thing about the First World War was the impact on the Isle of Man bed and breakfast industry. All you ever hear normally is Somme this and Gallipoli that. What about poor Mrs. Boothroyd on the promenade? She bought 6 dozen eggs in, couldn't use them, no one there. Luckily, as we know, the Americans got involved when President Wilson said he could not stand by while Douglas's guest houses stayed empty. And eventually the trade recovered. It must have just seemed wild here. This was still a time when most people couldn't imagine a holiday. You were the Ibiza of the 30s. There's probably people here going, all right, yeah, this is the Gaiety Theatre with a big shout-out for Ernest, Maud, Stanley, Amy, the Spinning Jenny, massive. This is the banging George Formby. We got 3 floors of pumping Banjalili coming out here. The acts are going to keep going to 9:30 p.m. Now, the island did play a much bigger part in the Second World War. The Isle of Man Examiner said at the start of the war, "The Führer knows exactly where he stands. He should remember the Manx in particular will stand for no nonsense." Do you know what? I think that's what swung it. It is true, of course, hundreds of people from the Isle of Man joined the forces, but the island was also affected because this is where the British government put its internment camps, where all Germans and Italians were imprisoned, including German Jews who'd fled from Nazi Germany because they were German. Now, what genius came up with that plan? You must have thought these prisoners were going, on the one hand, I'm Jewish, so that makes me sort of slightly wary of Hitler. But then again, I'm German, so I can't help but love him. After the war, the tourist scene kept going until the 1960s when package holidays took over and then the island needed a new industry. So in 1960, the government here abolished surtax. This is the sort of advert that went into international newspapers to attract the wealthy to come and live here. The Isle of Man is a tax haven in the British Isles. As such, it offers low income tax, imposes no surtax, no estate duties and no capital gains tax. Not a word of what it's like here. Look, come and live here. There's a lovely seaside and we've even got an electric railway, if you can believe it. So all sorts of people came here. According to No Man is an Island, the period from 1970 to 1982 has been described as the Wild West without a sheriff. One notorious character, Chris Kingston, pioneered the practice of using groups of 3 companies, each owning the capital of the next, so there was no owner of any of them. He also kept llamas and interviewed people for their jobs wearing stockings, suspenders and a traffic cone. Never mind the Wild West, it sounds like you've been invaded by the Bullingdon Club. I do think the outcome of all of this, it has created quite an exotic atmosphere in a way, like where Douglas is part driven by the modern demands of banking and finance, but part of it is still like an old seaside town. When I went along around St George's Street area, and Liz, who's a journalist here, told me, oh, this is the banking district. And I thought, oh, it was brilliant, because it's only tiny. It's some of the sweetest banking district. It should be called the Square Inch, I think. But At the bottom of that area, just about 50 yards away, is the pub that has a rusty sign that says, pipe tobacco sold here. It's brilliant. There was a bloke there with these huge sideburns who was just stood on the step outside smoking a pipe. So you wander around here and you're not sure whether you're in 2030 or 1950. It's the most brilliant mix. There's probably folk singers who go, this is a little song about a tragedy from the past. 'Twas in the year of 2008, 5 brave stockbrokers came into town. And then in a flash, their subprimes crashed and their bonuses all went down. There you go. So on the one hand, these financial consultants dealing with billions advise their clients to base their capital here, but at the same time, this is the sort of thing that goes on. Now, this is an account from Colin Bishop, who's a bus driver. The last bus from Port Sodrick to Douglas was 11 o'clock at night. On my first night, I waited, but nobody came. So I came back and put my bus in the garage. Then I heard the phone ring and the inspector answered and shouted, who's just come back from Port Sodrick? I said, I have. He said, you've left 20 people there. I said, there was no one at the bus stop. He said, you're supposed to go in the pub and get them. It's the same with the social ideas here, because your image, it's not necessarily of being all that liberal. Now, I can't help wondering who drew up the laws in the past. You know, some of them, it just seems to me that there was a phone-in show, and then one day, whatever the caller said, that was the law. Here, all this tax I'm paying, I'm working for nothing. They want a scrap tax. Yeah, right then. Now we're going to Brian from Peel. These youngsters, they've no respect. They need birching. Yeah, right. I know it isn't fair, I know that. I know that you only birched people now and then. And the last time anyone was sentenced to be birched was 1981. It's going to be a hard image to shake off. It will eventually. It's like the woman who put a cat in the wheelie bin, isn't it? You know, she's probably done loads of other things, made lovely apple crumbles, played very good at bridge, just cat, cat, cat. And all this seems to be part of the way it is here, part ahead of everybody else and part magnificently a century behind. I think that's something to be proud of. You know, we're here at the centre of the world's finance, and yet there's a bridge between the airport and the town where everyone has to say hello to fairies. And you take this seriously. The taxi driver who brought me was really persistent when I said, oh, do I have to? Yes! I thought, blimey, I bet when Richard Dawkins comes here, he ends up going, all right, hello, fairies. And then the taxi drivers all tell you these stories. They do seem to do that. Oh, I picked up these financial advisors once, and they wouldn't say hello to the fairies. Next day, I read in the paper they'd gone to their meeting. All eaten by a stray leopard. Someone told me, actually, that if you get the bus that goes along there, that as it goes over, there's this mass mumbling of all the people. Hello, fairy. The marvellous thing about this fairy bridge thing is that is rational compared to the story of Jeff, the talking mongoose. Now, at this point, I would like to introduce Dave Fisher, who is an expert on Manx fairies and related goblins. And, Dave, what's the crack with Jeff?
Well, Jeff was said to be a mongoose. He was in a place called Dawlish Cashen in the west of the island, in Derby. I think there was a lot of interest in the paranormal in the 1930s. It was perfect poltergeist activity. Somebody had a needle thrown across the room and stones thrown at the window. A
needle thrown across the room? Because that's typical mongoose behaviour.
But what isn't much known about is that Jeff used to hitchhike. Jeff apparently was known for hitchhiking on buses. And there's a bus conductor who was convinced and swore that Jeff ate his sandwiches.
This was a huge story right across Britain, wasn't it? Not just here.
Oh, right across the world. People came from America. I know the News of the World was here, and they were a former newspaper.
God, we keep trying to get hold of the mongoose, but we can only get his voicemail. Thanks very much, Dave. It's absolutely brilliant. Thank you very much. There's a Manx film industry now, of course. Johnny Depp made a film here. I wonder, was it Pirates of the Caribbean 4? With Keira Knightley going, Captain Jack, the entire British fleet are chasing us and the crew have turned into zombies. And him going, if you don't like it, dear, there'll be a ghost ship in the morning. And you should have your own song in the Eurovision Song Contest. You've got enough songs for it. I bought a record of some of them. There was one called The Wreck of the Herring Fleet, which I think is like Lady Gaga, but with fish. And there's a famous Manx song called Kiri Fod Nachti, which is an old ballad often sung here in Manx, and the translation goes, the snow's on the mountain, the snow's in the gill, my sheep they have wandered all over the hill. Uprise then, my shepherds, with haste let us go, where my sheep are all buried deep under the snow. Then there's some more verses, all of which end, my sheep are all buried deep under the snow. And then the last verse goes, then up rose those shepherds, with haste they did go, where the sheep lay all buried deep under the snow. They sought them with sorrow, they sought them with dread, and they found them at last, but the sheep were all dead. Some stories just have a twist that you can't see coming. Of course they were all bloody dead. They were buried deep under the snow. I want to know if there's another Manx song that goes, I must find my cow. I can't wait to see if it's doing all right since it fell off the cliff. Now, there is a revival in Manx national culture at the moment, especially the language. Now, I'd sort of learnt this. I'm going to try and do it without looking. Tan rad yan ein lectra, which means our railway's electric, you know. Now, I want to speak to Brian Stoll, who I think's here, and Brian, I think it's fair to say that you played a part in reviving the Manx language.
Yeah, but just a small part. I was a kid at school when I got interested in Manx, and I went round with particularly Doug Farragher and others who were recording Manx.
Well, one of the thoughts I think was brilliant here when you talk about it is that when people first went to try and pick up the Manx phrases to revive it, that some of the language was sort of much coarser than it would be in English, wasn't it?
Well, it reflects the Isle of Man was a very rural society. And particularly posh Victorians would have been scandalised by some of the things that were said in Manx. When commercial cookers were made available, before that everyone had to cook on fires, obviously. One old fella said about the cooker when he saw it, he was amazed by it, he said, Yenach be my je kek kavel. It would make good food off horse shit. And this was a sort of great accolade for the cooker. And one of my favourites was the story about what women would say to men coming into the house would be things like Trids Jack as chow the Vagalen, which I hope some people here can understand. Come in and warm your balls.
Thanks very much, Brian, and thanks very much. Good. Best of luck for... It does seem to be, this marvellous effort to pursue this policy of being old and modern at the same time, because while one chunk of the island is trying to revive this Celtic language, another part of it has decided the next industry you're going to dominate is space travel. And space companies are basing themselves here, and according to NASA, the countries who are most likely to stage the next moon landing are, in order, America, Russia, China, India, the Isle of Man. So you've got a space centre. You've bought 2 space stations. People listening aren't going to believe this, are they? And the plan is to set up a space tourist industry. So you'll be telling people, we don't have any direct flights as yet as far as Paris. But we can get you to Venus. I'm not sure if you're aware, but there are different theories as to your motives here. For example, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of David Icke. But he has studied the matter, and this is what he's written. It is my belief, through lengthy research, that the Isle of Man is the remnant of Atlantis. At the time Atlantis was destroyed, the people of Atlantis were mining for helium on Saturn. After time, the ability to travel to Saturn was lost, and helium was not found on Earth, so their spacecraft were buried deep in the sands of Egypt as pyramids. And finally, he knits the whole story together. Therefore, the Saturn aliens have claimed the Isle of Man as a holy place. And that is why the Queen is the Lord of Man and wears a Saturn hat. Every time I read that, I find myself going, oh, my old Queen's from Saturn. She wears a Saturn hat. And when she's mining helium, her voice goes up like that. And it's fitting, I think, now that you have a space industry, as the thriving film industry here is planning, I was told, a new Star Trek film set in the Isle of Man. And I was allowed to have a look at the script, and so I'll finish tonight, Douglas, by reading the opening lines to the new Star Trek film set in the Isle of Man, which is a fitting testimony to Douglas. Captain's log, stardate 5th of May 3013. We have landed on a most peculiar and unfathomable planet. One of their residents approached Mr. Spock and said, wow, you've got the 3-litre Starship Coupe Turbo GL. Reaches Mach 3 in less than 8 seconds and takes black holes like a dream. Then they informed us we could stay unharmed, and spaceship duty was only 2% of the agreed galactic rates, as agreed by the longest continuous parliament in the galaxy, except for a 50-year period in the 21st century when their leaders gave up running the planet to pour coffee. If I was to summarise this planet in one word, I think I would choose mischief. And after all, if you don't like it, you can be beamed up in the morning. Thanks very much.
The Mark Steele's in town, Scroot as Jint Joris Mark Steele, Les Tullia Stu Joris Pete Sinclair, as Venjantach Sam Bryant.